Dr. Schaefer will be using some instant do. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Timothy Schaefer as our guest scholar for today. Dr. Schaefer is an assistant professor in the Department of Communications Studies and an assistant director of the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy, which are both housed at Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. Tim is also principal research specialist with the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona, as well as an associate editor for the Journal of Public Deliberation. As a scholar, Tim centers his research on the advancement of democratic practices through deliberative politics and citizen engagement by civic professionals in higher education and other institutions. Schaefer is published in journals such as The Good Society, the National Civic Review, and the Journal for Public Deliberation. He is co-editor of Deliberative Pedagogy, Teaching and Learning for Democratic Engagement, and co-author of Making Democracy Work as It Should, Stories and Lessons from Cooperative Extension Professionals. Dr. Schaefer received his PhD from Cornell, and Tim, I am turning the screen and mic over to you.
Fantastic. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, you know what, you can't respond, so I hope that that's an affirmative. I put headphones on, so hopefully it's a little clearer than just speaking through. Yep, good. Thanks, Maxine. There we go, positive. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about this thing called deliberative pedagogy. And for whatever reason, maybe you're just looped in with the civic engagement movement, part of IRSlice, whatever it might be. These terms kind of wedded may not be the most familiar to you. And so hopefully today, what I can do is help introduce maybe some concepts and ideas that are complementary to, but not necessarily grounded in just the way that many of us think about community engagement. So to frame it in that way, and then to really have a conversation about where these fields of deliberative democracy and higher ed's kind of civic engagement movement really intertwine, and frankly, why it matters. So that's a very general kind of path for our conversation today. And as Monica said, I am going to use here on the very front end a platform called Poll Everywhere. So you can use your computer or you can use a phone to participate. It would be really great. And what we're going to do is start with this kind of question. So this should come up. Here we go. Oh, of course, everything starts flying around. What it's going to ask here in just a second when the screen goes live is it's going to ask you your, oh, for goodness sakes. Okay. Oh. It looks like this one's gonna work for us. So we'll start here, since it looks like we were having, for some odd reason, that first one having a glitch. What you can do is you can respond. You can see that link at the top here. You can see my cursor. You can go to pollev.com and then that / TJ Schaefer. Make sure you spell it correctly, or else it won't work. Or you can text. And what we'll start to see is, in response to this question, do you teach about deliberation or political discourse, or what you would say are kind of related topics? So just to start us here, so this is live action, so we'll start to see. We'll give people a few moments here to respond, and we'll go from there. And if you're using the texting function, just make sure you text that name, TJ Schaefer, to that number, and then you can type in A, B, C, or D. And if you're doing it on your computer, it's rather clear there. So what we're starting to see is it'll keep fluctuating, and I'll keep it on the screen for a moment here. But an interesting mix of responses. We're seeing 36% saying both yes and no. It'll play around a little bit here, but also a number of people who say maybe, but I'm not totally sure. And that's part of the conversation today, is to be able to talk through this and to see where maybe the work that we do or that you do, in whatever context you are, whether you're a tenure track faculty or if you're a contingent, if you are someone who works in your center for engagement, or if you're a graduate student, maybe serving as a TA, the multiple places in which we occupy space within the higher ed landscape really, I think, afford a lot of opportunities to think about some of these kinds of issues and questions. So if anybody has one last plug-in, we'll stay here. But so this is interesting. So we're all right. So we're it'll keep bouncing back and forth, but a pretty divided group. So this is good. I'm glad we're going to be able to talk about some of this together. So if you responded yes, how do you refer to this work? So you can just type in a full word, using the same methods that you just used. So if you do teach about deliberation or political discourse, or something that in your mind is related, what does that look like? Or how do you name that, or how do you refer to that? And we'll just do this for a couple moments here. All right, so leadership, framing messages, again, another framing of leadership, but through a civic lens. I'm seeing a theme. All right, so some coming through a communication place, intercultural communication, political discourse. We'll keep it here for another minute, and if people have a chance to respond. All right. If you don't have something to say, you also don't have to respond. Don't feel compelled. All right, so another intercultural communication. All right. So I'm seeing some paths here of how people come to some of this work, of thinking about this as either leadership, civic leadership, but also this idea of civic discourse, civic communication. I would kind of put those in similar places, as well as this intercultural, and that last one that came in a moment ago, this idea of community-based learning. The terms that we use in some ways can be helpful for us depending on our context, but for our purposes, realizing that depending on where you're coming from, the language that we employ for this is obviously going to vary. And so let me ask this bigger question. So how do you approach teaching and learning? So if someone, whether it's a colleague within the university or someone beyond, they kind of ask how you approach your space, and whether it's in a classroom. And I want to emphasize when I'm saying teaching and learning, a lot of that's going to happen in a classroom environment, but obviously some of that's going to be community-based as well, non-formal kind of settings or informal settings as well. So how do you approach in a short kind of way? Okay, in a collaborative, co-created manner. Co-creation, okay. Student-centric, okay, this is good. And we'll do this for another couple moments here. Again, the theme of collaborative emerging. And as people are putting some things here, I do want to just note, poll everywhere. I like to use this because it's fun and interactive, but also it's a great platform that you too can use. There's a version for higher ed that's free, and for our purposes, that's exactly what I'm doing. So you can do these same kinds of things in real time in classes and presentations. I find it to be quite helpful to get people to engage. So we're seeing lots of collaborative language, some developmental frameworks, experiential service learning, some transformative learning, some constructivist in partnership between kind of youth and adults. So this co-creation, anti-oppression. Okay, this is good. Just another moment here. So we could stay with this, but we're beginning to kind of get a sense of who's with us today. So keep this in mind as we continue to talk. And so here's one that you might have a little trouble with. How would you define, and I've given you virtually no context or background, but how would you define deliberative pedagogy? Or what do you think, maybe another way to say it, when I use those words, what do you think I'm trying to communicate? Intense. That is true. Or maybe that was for the last one, but that may be for this one. I guess we'll see. So any other responses for how would you give some meaning to this phrase? So thoughtful, engaged learning. That's great. And I would agree. Oh, yes, good. Somebody's naming public choice. Okay, so this idea of dialogue leading to some kind of public decision making, either process or decision. All right, we're on to something here. Some discourse-based dialogue. And again, just another minute for some responses. A conversation, okay. So it's interesting to see some of this. This is a little slower. We're quicker to be able to respond to our own experiences and practices, and understandably, some of these concepts are maybe slightly foreign, so it takes a little bit more to think through this. But the idea of dialogue, discourse, conversation, capacity building, all of these things being really interconnected, and I think really foundational to deliberative pedagogy. So let me move into this. Fundamentally, the way that I'm going to talk about deliberative pedagogy is building on these three kind of interrelated pieces. This big picture idea of politics, some democratic theory and practice, and then also this third leg of pedagogy. And when I say politics, I mean kind of in the David Matthews style, Harry Boyd style of politics, of a different kind of politics. It's not just this kind of image, right? This is the formal dimensions of democratic society are things that we know and understand to the degree that we do. But this is one aspect of thinking about what politics, what democratic life looks like, what it feels like, and also importantly, what it means to engage and to participate in the practice of democracy. And we have many examples of public discourse, whether it's with city commission meetings or the image, that large image there on the left is from the town hall meetings of 2010. We have a lot of examples of public discourse going poorly. We're not at a loss for seeing these or reading about it or experiencing it. But there are many ways in which this idea of politics and deliberation, democratic practice can be manifest in more kind of constructive ways. And so I like to pair the kind of shouting images with these that really point to, and many of you are probably familiar, and you would have your own images somewhere in some file on your computer of groups of people standing around desks and tables with tear sheets and big notepads and lots of ideas, depending on what the topic or the content might really be. And so as we're starting this conversation, I want to just, sometimes it's helpful. I'm going to use kind of dialogue and deliberation in a particular way. And sometimes it's helpful to see that as a contrast to a framework that's more in a debate style, that there are winners and losers, that it's more of a combative process. And when we think about formal politics, it often falls a little bit more onto that column on the left rather onto the right, assuming that there is a right answer and that you've got it, in contrast to thinking that maybe you've got a piece of it, that you've got to work with some others to pull some of this together. So this is a very simplistic kind of almost either side. But I want to also put this here, is that, and some of these terms were getting used earlier, and which is great. But when I say deliberation, I mean particularly what you're seeing there at the bottom of the screen. This idea, and why it's helpful to see where some of these words come from, is because I think it teases out these differences. So the debate literally means to fight, to kind of beat down. In contrast to this idea of having a discussion or a conversation that is a dynamic that gives people turns to speak and to engage, and in some ways similar to dialogue. Deliberation is a lot of that, but also it regards this, and somebody used this language before, of public choice, of how do we have conversation of significance where we're weighing and considering tensions and trade-offs. How are we finding that idea of, you can think of a scale of how are we finding the things that we may not love everything, but we're going to pursue a kind of a path. And there are lots of manifestations of dialogue and deliberation. The National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation has some great resources. You can go to their website and find some of this. But depending on what kind of issues and topics you're working on, you really want to use different methods and frameworks. So sometimes some people might be familiar with something like the National Issues Forums or deliberative polling, which is appropriate in a certain context and contrast to something like study circles or World Cafe, where you're really trying to explore a topic or an issue. Maybe another way to look at this, and again, this is coming from NCDD, but is fundamentally asking, what are you trying to do, and what might be the ways you might most appropriately respond to it when you're trying to use dialogue and deliberation as a starting point, as a foundation, as a backbone for your work. There are a lot of organizations that do this kind of work. And I realize I'm going kind of quickly through this, but we will share these slides so you can look at the depth there. But NCDD has a lot of materials that might be quite useful to those who are not familiar with that organization. But these are some of the organizations that exist out there in real life that are committed to this idea of dialogue and deliberation being an essential part to democratic life. A lot of platforms. The National Institute for Civil Discourse, for example, has a platform called Text Talk Act, Text Talk Vote, and various iterations, Text Talk Revive Civility, which is a platform you can use on your cell phone and to help facilitate a small group conversation. And each of these organizations have kind of models and methods for thinking about engagement through this deliberative lens. So I just want to note that even though these are not necessarily embedded within higher education, there are a lot of things that are really complementary to the work that many of us try to do, and I think are significant to note. And so for me, this idea of deliberative pedagogy connects between how do we build these practices in classroom settings and experiences, as well as in kind of these community environments. And so I want to talk a little bit about how some of this work shows up in the work that I do. John Gastill, a communication scholar and political scientist, he offers in this book, Democracy in Small Groups, this kind of decision tree. And sometimes we don't need democratic processes and practices. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, sometimes we just need to make executive decisions. Sometimes we really don't need to go into this full-blown democratic decision-making process. But there are many instances, and we could probably think and begin to onlay to hear some of our community engagement work, where we could see like, oh yeah, we really do need to operate in this democratic framework that is participatory in the decision-making process, as well as kind of the implementation. And as he says, you know, democratic procedures often provide the best path to sound judgment and effective implementation, but even the most conscientious classroom, community group, or family faces hazards when it commits to a democratic process. I.e., this stuff is hard. It's not always easy. It's really challenging, and it can force us to reimagine sometimes who we are and the work that we're doing. Another big key concept to public deliberation work is, it comes from Dan Yankelovich, but this idea of public judgment, of that there's this initial step or stage of just raising people's awareness of an issue. And as you move into that stage two, this idea of working through, that's really where this deliberative work happens. If we take the time with intentionality, and again, a lot of us know this from service learning or community engagement work, if we're taking serious our partnerships and our relationships with those that we're working with, this takes a long time to figure out what are the issues, how do we identify them, how do we name them, how do we even begin to frame them before we move into a space where we start to take action, or even coming to this place where we might say we are coming to a point of resolution. And again, you know, John Gastill kind of makes this statement that, you know, our ideas of democracy are always changing, they're always evolving. And now all of a sudden, in contrast to just going back to that image of Congress, we're thinking about a lot of environments being more political than we would have otherwise. So thinking about civic associations or business meetings or our schools, our classrooms, or even our family settings, our familial environments, how do we think about those things through this kind of democratic lens? And so I want to suggest that deliberative pedagogy is part of this larger system of thinking about democratic ideas and practices. So what is deliberative pedagogy? Fundamentally, it's rooted in democratic deliberative theory. And in contrast, deliberative politics, we're really talking about pedagogy, so it's affecting our decision-making with teaching, learning, and engagement, both in classrooms and in community settings. And I want to be clear that even though I'm using the term pedagogy, that we're talking about both of those environments. And then it's really grounded in both the theory and practice of pedagogy, as well as this really large field of engaged scholarship. And for us, it's about creating a learning environment that models these democratic habits and practices, which is inclusive of deliberation. So fundamentally, it's a way of teaching and learning for democracy. So if there's a way to kind of sum up the way that I and many other colleagues who have been working in this area define this, I would put it this way, that deliberative pedagogy is this democratic educational process of thinking that encourages students to encounter the multiple perspectives. And that's why I wanted to differentiate between dialogue and conversation and deliberation. Deliberation really is about this weighing of tensions and trade-offs, of figuring out, do we understand the complexity of an issue before we can try to take some action about it? And then, so this second point, that it's simultaneously a way of teaching that is deliberative and also in a process of developing these skills. And I'll offer a couple examples to help make that a little bit more real. And then maybe most importantly, the work of deliberative pedagogy is about creating space. It's about creating the civic space to really hold authentic and productive dialogue. You know, these kinds of conversations that, as somebody said earlier when they referred to their work being transformative, I would also share that sentiment, that we're not just creating like, oh, that was interesting or curious, but how do we create environments where people can have these transformative moments, that they see themselves differently as kind of civic actors and citizens. And so a number of colleagues, maybe some names that you recognize, we have been working on this in recent years, and we've begun to have some publications in various places. Nick Longo, this is an article from the Journal of Public Deliberation, and Sarah Drury at Wabash, Nick at Providence, and Sarah at Wabash College, writing in a variety of contexts, some focusing on the deliberative piece, some focusing on the teaching piece, and others. Sarah has another essay, for example, in a science journal, because they've done this work in around issues of climate change. And so how do you embed this work into a variety of settings is really important. And for us, what our forthcoming volume, that large image on the right, builds on a lot of previous work that has engaged these questions about deliberative democracy and its place and appropriateness in higher education. So some of this, and some of the authors and contributors to those efforts on the left have really, they are also contributors to our project, but have really instrumentally founded and played an important role in this. So the roots of this particular project, there had been a conversation starting at least in 2002, but in its more recent iteration, about 2011, a group of scholars coming together from across the United States and around the world a few times a year to share and collaborate on ideas, to share ideas, what they're doing, what they might learn from others. And all of a sudden, we started to realize that we had all these reports and people were starting, as I just pointed to, starting to publish in various places. And we felt this is a language that has an appropriateness and a relevance to the work that we're all trying to do. So we need to help disseminate and share this. So we saw this as an opportunity to help build the conversation. And so that's what has led us to seeking out the publication of this book as part of the Transformations in Higher Ed series with Michigan State, just because we want to further this conversation and seeing it being really important and relevant to a lot of people. This project has included people from all different kinds of disciplines, and so it's been really exciting and interesting to hear how people embed this work in disciplinary settings. And significantly, I also want to note the people talking about their work and reflecting on their work are multiple in the ways that they are speaking about creating syllabi, or thinking about their community partnerships, or approaching One article, for example, a colleague from Hungary writes about as student protests, how they then morphed into this more kind of deliberative process. So really kind of a spectrum of how we're thinking about this, both from a disciplinary standpoint as well as from an institutional type. So we have community colleges, historically Black institutions, all the way up through private public institutions across the spectrum. And so our particular volume has been broken into these kind of categories, providing some theory and history to this work, as well as, and fundamentally, those 2 through 5, those parts are about practices. So this volume is very oriented to practice chapters, is how most of them have been written. So this is designed for, we imagined it being on the shelf in lots of centers for community engagement or on faculty shelves where it could become really quite useful. It's not just academic kind of jargon and talk, but really kind of practical application. So what does this feel like? What does this look like? So part of it is about building and creating space. So some of that is building your syllabi. Some of that is then manifest in, as one contributor to our project has written about first-year programs, others talking about kind of co-curricular projects, or also just embedding it within traditional disciplinary fields. So in the classes that people teach within their home disciplines and places. But this idea of creating community engagement based on these principles of participation, equity, and voice through these deliberative practices and lenses is really what we see deliberative pedagogy offering to the conversation about engagement. And then also significantly being able to look at some of this through a critical lens. And we importantly have a number of chapters that ask these questions about assessment in a broad way of defining that, of how do we identify the deliberative moments within discrete educational experiences, i.e. something in a class, as well as these larger kind of projects that build off of this work. And in my own work here at Kansas State, I always use the same principles that we use in our community deliberative work in our classrooms. And so you can see these ideas of how do we create a space where we inherently know we're going to have conflicting views and positions, and it would be it would be important for us to talk in our classroom spaces in the same ways. That how do we have opportunities for everyone to speak? How do we listen respectfully and thoughtfully, even when we don't necessarily agree? How do we support what we're saying and appreciating the differences in communication and so on? And so for me, part of this shows up, and I've published on this in the Journal of Public Affairs, but creating, it's a very cumbersome title, I apologize, but it's to the point. Something that I do from in a course that I teach on small group communication through this deliberative lens is literally on the first day when we're going over the syllabus, I leave, as you see these lines, I leave them open, and I put students into kind of a crash course of deciding, like, how do they want to evaluate themselves? How do they want to weigh these 5 elements of a course, and at the end of the day hold themselves accountable to that? And so this is one way. It's there's not a lot of introduction for them, but it offers just that sense of like, oh wow, what would it mean, or what would it look like? How would it feel for me as a student to all of a sudden have a different degree of ownership, even in something like this? And so I have found this to be an interesting experiment that students in the moment don't necessarily love, but they find it to be kind of constructive, and it also helps to ground them in both the content. And so that same class organizes these kinds of forums. How do you not only create the space in a classroom structurally, but also then how do they learn those particular kind of practices? So for the last few years, we've been working on issues around safety, particularly as it relates to state law changing around concealed handguns on campuses. So students have the opportunity to practice these deliberative elements within class, but also to apply them in real world settings. Another really helpful thing, and I'm glad you'll have a chance to look at this later when the PDF or when the slides come out, but this is a graphic that comes from our pedagogy book that a number of colleagues have created that speaks to the different levels. And so what are these learning outcomes, as well as the developmental steps that we might think about opportunities for deliberation really having on students. And so you can see these different levels really being quite important and significant in the development of the maturation of these practices. Deliberation, like a lot of other things, just doesn't happen once, and so it's how do we embed these approaches and experiences within a variety of settings for people to develop in their own ways that they mature, moving from that kind of left to right to where they really understand where they situate and see themselves as civic actors. So what, right? That's maybe interesting, but as you're engaging in this work of service learning and community engagement, why does all that stuff matter? And I would invite you to maybe, before we kind of walk through that door, to listen to yourself a little bit here, right? So let's slow down. Do you hear within yourself something that says, oh, I do that, or that's kind of like, fill in the blank? Maybe what are these practices that you currently use in your classrooms or in your community engagement work that you would consider deliberative or democratic? Maybe you don't use those terms, but now all of a sudden, as you're seeing some examples and hearing some of this language, you're seeing where you will now identify maybe in some of these ways. And through this conversation, what has made you pause and consider maybe doing something differently? Maybe you don't want to change your syllabus to where you kind of give free rein, but what might be some practices, maybe structurally, creating the space in your own environments that would allow it to be a little bit more deliberative and democratic? And then finally, how does deliberative pedagogy change how you think about service learning and community engagement? And I just want to say that it's really hard to break habits and to see things differently. I know that's true for me, and I feel like that's a pretty uniform human experience. That I like to use this. This is an image of the Declaration of Independence that, as Jefferson was authoring it, as you can see here, he refers to fellow citizens. But in the early iterations, and this made news a number of years ago, he, even in the moment of somebody creating this democratic experiment in the United States, got stuck on, so underneath citizens, he basically scratched out this word of subjects. And so it's really hard to break out of the mode, the world that we live in, and to function a little differently. And in the same way, and if you've seen this, before, we might see things a certain way, but all of a sudden, once we start to play around a little bit differently, it alters. And I think in some ways, deliberative pedagogy offers a little bit of a shaking or a complement to the work, the way that we typically just frame it anyway, as we think about service learning, as we think about community engagement, and as we think about ourselves as engaged scholars. Part of this, it's not just doing things for students or having them have these experiences, but it really is, and I can attest to this, it's in large part a transformation of who you are and how you see yourself as a scholar. How do you position yourself in relationship as a co-creator of knowledge with others, in contrast to this kind of disseminator of information, or in the model of Freire, this kind of banking model. So I'm going to wrap up here, and then we're going to have hopefully some conversation. I think there's a road ahead of us, and here I am in the middle of America, and so I see a lot of fields that look like this. I think our work, and I would love to have some conversation about this, but I think we have some fertile ground to work with and in that, as for across the board for engaged scholarship and practice. But I think these deliberative elements can really help us cultivate, I think, these democratic habits and ideas that not only change how students see themselves and engage and maybe transform at that level, but also for us in our departments, in our colleges and universities. But realizing this path sometimes looks more like this, right? It gets a little bumpy and hilly, and you don't know exactly where you're going, and sometimes you feel like maybe you're gonna veer off, and that's not always a lot of fun, to have that sense of unease, or not necessarily knowing where you're going. But, and here's my last travel picture, and then we'll have this conversation. We're in this together, right? So I would encourage you and invite you in the ways that you want to kind of throw your bag in the back and hop along for this ride, because I think this discussion about the intersection of democratic practices and democratic life and deliberation with our deep commitment for many of us to community engagement, all their roots are founded in the same kind of place. How do we live well with one another? How do we interact with our colleagues, with our students, with our community partners, in ways that are authentic and genuine, and importantly, wrestling with the issues of the day, the things that matter. So it's not just like, oh, that was good, but how do we really wrestle with the tensions and the trade-offs? And I think that's what deliberation really has to offer us. And so I just want to put this here. This is some of the information about the book. It will be out this summer. We have there's a pre-order discount that is available. I think it's only currently on the MSU Press website at this moment, but I think it will start going to other places pretty soon. But we really see this volume as the beginning of a conversation, kind of a first step in really developing this language and discourse around this work. And so there's some information here, and I spoke with Tara, and she will help to pass this along to you all. So let's have a conversation. And I don't know how, I think, Monica, I've been trying not to get too distracted by the chat box, but it looks like stuff's coming in. So if there was ever a point where it seemed like I didn't know what I was saying, that's probably why.
No, it's great.
Because it looks like great questions, but I'm really excited to have some discussion. And as we said on the front end, when we run out of time here, I am more than happy to engage in discussion with you about really specific issues or questions, or maybe implementation in your own environments.
Great, yes. So we do have several questions, and we have about, I guess about 19, 20 minutes for question and answer for us to open up. And if you have not posted a question in the chat box, please do. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the first question. And I'm sorry, I don't know who posted this question. It doesn't have a name posted. But the question is, do you, Tim, or others who engage in this type of work or scholarship, use deliberative pedagogy to engage students, partners, community members, faculty, etc., around issues either inside or outside the classroom?
Yes. So I have used, I'll just speak from my own experience. I've used this kind of approach in a number of settings, as I use that example of kind of co-creating our learning through the construction of a syllabus. A lot of this happens. I teach. I mean, so this is where I have kind of the double whammy of I teach about deliberation and democracy at the same time that I'm also using those principles. So, you know, there are colleagues that I know who just teach about kind of democracy as a thing that exists out there, but I try to embody it, and so it shapes how we do a lot of work. All of the assignments are kind of through this approach, very collaborative and engaging, and so that leads to, you know, the beyond the classroom work. Every semester since I've been here and predating when I've been elsewhere, I always have students help to organize deliberative forums, and so I've had students work on the issue of the future of higher education. To most recently, this semester we've been working on an NIF guide on safety and justice, so community police relations. We created our own materials around the concealed handgun law that's changing in July of this year. So I have very intentionally had these experiences, and sometimes the students don't always realize, and then later a few of them will be like, oh my gosh, we were doing the thing that we're now talking about. And I think that's very important, is that at least I learned this way, but a lot of this learning by doing, so it really comes from that place. But it transcends, it's in both community as well as classroom settings. But it's we also have some contributions from in our book about institutional change. So some places that have really committed to this in kind of structural ways. How do you create the kind of the infrastructure for these initiatives to exist and to happen? So that's another way to think about this too. So it's not just classroom, but it's also in the ways, how do we structure ourselves departmentally, organizationally, that can have longer kind of lasting impacts.
Right, and that's kind of a follow-up to a question that I was going to post, but in terms of contextual or cultural differences that you see in the deliberative process when you're using this type of pedagogy, are there challenges and barriers versus working with, say, a community organization or a collaborative that works out in the community rather than working in the classroom with students, or with maybe more kind of policy-oriented dialogue where you're looking to create organizational change? Do you see any kind of contextual or cultural differences in your experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the significant things is, and this is why I put up that kind of that decision tree from John Gastel, is that sometimes you really don't need all of this kind of deliberative talk. If you're working with, say, an advocacy organization, they have a very clear agenda and kind of a purpose for what they're doing. Deliberative work really is most helpful when there's a contentious public issue and some decision needs to be made about it. And so how do you bring together diverse groups, either individuals, organizations, communities, however you want to say that, and how do you have the kind of constructive conversation that says, well, we need to do X in our community, but we only have limited resources, and all the other things that we might begin to list. How do we begin to talk about that in a way through these deliberative practices that create space for people with divergent views? And as we know, as we continue to reside in this long shadow after the election of last year, people are still really divided in many ways, and these deliberative practices help to get people off of sometimes those categories or the affiliations that they might otherwise have, and to really engage about topics that don't fit easily into some of those kinds of categories. And so that's where these deliberative approaches really become helpful. It's not a do it every time for everything, but when it is appropriate is really when people are stuck. When we have a wicked problem and there's not a technical solution, there's not a kind of a straightforward thing that needs to happen. So that's really where it happens. And to your point of context, that's where it becomes really important. One of the central tenets of deliberative democracy is, how do you engage diversity? And there are lots of obstacles and challenges to that, of whether it's about the way that people speak, the sense of power and agency that they might have, even the time and place. Where does this happen? I say that all the time to students. It's like, well, you have to be cognizant of, like, who has childcare, who doesn't, what resources might we utilize that could help alleviate some of those concerns or issues. Maybe we locate it in a place where people could walk to, rather than needing to drive and park on campus and get a pass and know where to go. All those types of things.
Right.
Those yeah, and many of the same. Yeah, the same kind of things that many people have written about as it relates just more to community engagement. How do you reduce some of those barriers between the institution and the broader community? And if we can have kind of this deliberative onlay to that as well, that's where I think it becomes really useful.
Okay, great. And this question is from Amar, and it's a great question, I think. How do you use this in an online course that has a service learning component?
Yes, that actually does happen. There's in fact a really robust platform called Common Ground for Action that has been created around a particular style of deliberation, national issues forums. So they use a certain kind of structure and model of laying out at least 3 options for topics. But it's this really interactive, it's kind of text-based, but the way it works, and I wish I could pull up a visual, but it has you kind of put your views on topics, and as you continue the conversation, it allows you to kind of see where your thinking shifts. And so then you begin to see where other people, through the process, maybe change their views or augment or adjust however slightly, that you can begin to see, like, what comes from these types of conversations. It's a tremendous resource. So yeah, Common Ground for Action is something that I would kind of speak to. Another thing, this is not, so that's really good for, like, say an online course. And they have it on a variety of topics, and you can also use the platform and kind of put your own stuff into it as well. Another one that is not so much for online, but utilizes technology, and I referred to a little bit ago, is Text Talk Act, or the Text Talk platform from NICD, the National Institute for Civil Discourse. They did one for the election called Text Talk Vote, and it's you literally text a number, and it gives you this prompt that your smartphone becomes the facilitator. It gives you some videos, gives you discussion questions. So if you have students, for example, and I've used this in class, in a group, 3, 4, 5 people, all of a sudden you're having this facilitated discussion without even having a quote facilitator. It's the technology is providing that. So yeah, the Creating Community Solutions Coalition, they did that first around mental health. It's a phenomenal resource, and that I would also encourage you to check that out as another tool to kind of put into your repertoire here that builds on these kind of deliberative ideas.
Great, and I put both of those links to both of those organizations, the Common Ground for Action and the Text Talk Act, into the chat box. So you
That's great. That's great, thanks. And I'm just gonna put up my contact info in case people need to disappear if you need or want to loop back around. So.
Great. And we have another question from Lori. Looks like we have about 10 more minutes. Lori asks, when is it best to just host dialogue versus deliberative dialogue? Are there times it is not beneficial to weigh and consider or lead to a choice, but perhaps just to explore?
Yes, Lori, yes, 1,000 times yes. And this is where I had a slide about these kind of streams of engagement that NCDD does, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. You really have to, importantly, know what you're trying to do and what you want to get out of something that shapes what you're trying to accomplish, shapes in significant ways what you use as a platform and a means for engaging in conversation. For example, we're using right now this issue guide called Safety and Justice: How Should Communities Reduce Violence? So it's through the National Issues Forum. It's this tremendous resource highlighting the experience that many of us see across the country of violence has had this uptick in just the last couple of years. What's going on? So how do we, address these issues, about enforcing the law together, applying the law fairly, de-escalating violence, preventing violence, these types of things. The reason I say that is this just came out, and the folks at NIF very intentionally say this topic was too hot to try to create this resource 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And I think there is a place, and importantly, an understanding of, like, sometimes you really just need to get people to talk. Sometimes you need to be able to just to vent a frustration or a concern or a fear or whatever it might be, or even just being able to engage with people who are different from you so you can hear from their experience. Trying to fit, it's kind of the peg hole situation. If you just go around all the time saying, we're going to do a forum, we're going to do a forum, we're going to do a forum, that ends up being really detrimental and I think potentially destructive and unhelpful for future possibilities, when in fact you might want to do that, but it just doesn't make sense for what you're trying to accomplish at that time and that moment. So that's where I think those kind of streams of engagement, I've done some work lately with a group of scholars, and I've used like the World Cafe style of conversation, because they're trying to co-create a vision for themselves as this group of scholars from about 20 different institutions, and that's what made sense in that situation and setting. And so I think a big part of this work of thinking about the dialogue and deliberative dimensions is to say what works in the setting that I'm in and for what we're trying to do, and not to force anything just because that's the one thing that you know or are familiar with. There are a lot of resources that exist now that you can find online, or if you start poking around a little bit, they exist there. I was just I'm on an executive committee with ECOP through the Cooperative Extension System. So we just produced, and it just came live a couple days ago, basically civil discourse competencies for extension agents on race relations, and how do you begin to think about that. And again, this is something that is responsive to a particular kind of issue in a certain kind of way. You're not just going to come in with kind of the prepackaged stuff, which is, like anything, how do you learn about and understand the nuance, what's appropriate in certain situations, and when can it actually be useful, but also when sometimes can it be detrimental. You have to be really attuned to that, and that's where it's important to recognize what you're trying to accomplish and what methods might be the ones to use in that situation.
Great, thank you. And then we have time for one more question. The second one from Amar. What does engaged scholarship mean to you, and do you see your work with deliberative pedagogy as a form of engaged scholarship?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes. I do see deliberative pedagogy being being kind of a strand of engaged scholarship. I, for a long time, have kind of straddled these worlds of deliberative democracy and the higher education kind of civic engagement work. I've been in settings where I've directed centers and programs, and now I occupy kind of a faculty researcher academic space. And for me, this deliberative work is rooted in this idea of who am I as a person, and especially as a professional in higher education. So this shapes how I think of myself, what I research, what I teach about, but also fundamentally how I interact and engage with people, both internal to the institution and beyond. And so all of this deliberative work really does emerge from this idea of higher education having a public purpose and a civic dimension, that this is one avenue to pursue that. We just hosted a couple days ago on Tuesday here at Kansas State our annual engagement symposium, and this year we actually talked about civil discourse. And so for me, that's a good example of kind of the wedding of these things. Of deliberation is, I think, a practice and an approach, one of these kind of democratic habits, to use that language, that I think can be introduced and fostered in within classrooms and as well as communities, but is part of a larger kind of suite of approaches and initiatives that I think, back to Lori's question, depending on what the situation calls for, is that's what you should do. So I very truly situate myself as part of that field. I, for example, contributed to the book that came out last year, The Publicly Engaged Scholars. As a graduate student, there was an earlier volume that was kind of a collection of graduate student voices put out through Syracuse. I've always kind of embedded my work and myself in that way. So it would be very difficult to separate them. But I think the argument that we make with deliberative pedagogy is that this is a distinct, it's complementary too, but there's a distinct element, which goes back to these principles of weighing the tensions and trade-offs, creating space for these kinds of conversations. And this is where, you know, a lot of you might say, oh yeah, I already do that. I'm already doing some of this kind of participatory work. I'm already engaging with groups of people in conversation about the issues that matter to them. Some of this is just a language thing, but I think there's a purposefulness to saying, how do we create a democratic environment where we might cultivate the opportunities for voice and for agency to occur that might not otherwise happen if we go into a place in a more kind of transactional way, or if we're doing it more just from a purely advocacy kind of position. Deliberation doesn't work real well in those. You can bring those people to the table, but it really is about bringing people to a table.
Okay, I forgot to unmute myself. Great, thank you so much. It looks like we have just a couple of minutes to wrap things up, and we don't have any more questions, but people are thanking you for this great session. And many thanks to all of you for participating in today's webinar. As I mentioned before, Tara will be making Tim's slides and the recording of the presentation available, and she will send it out to the participants probably early next week. It takes some time to get those documents in order. And also, the goal of IR Slice is to continue to offer monthly webinars, and we're always looking for future scholars to host a webinar. So if you're a faculty member, graduate student, or a practitioner scholar, or know someone who has a research work in progress or would like to have their research project highlighted, please submit your idea to the link, which I'm going to put right there in the chat box, and we can work with you on getting your webinar set up. So again, thank you for helping us make this webinar a success, and a very special thank you to our featured scholar, Tim Schaefer, for making this important research available to us. And with that, we'll end today's webinar and leave you to enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim.